In the early 1900s, aviation was a fragile, dangerous novelty. Most industrialists viewed aircraft as liabilities for daredevils, not components of a viable transportation industry. William Boeing viewed it differently. A wealthy timber magnate from the Pacific Northwest, he had already built a fortune by shipping wood across the country through the newly opened Panama Canal. His interest in flight took him to a 1910 aviation meet in Los Angeles, where he spent days asking every pilot for a ride. He was famously ignored by a French aviator who packed up his plane and left, leaving Boeing standing on the airfield. Boeing eventually bought his own Glenn L. Martin seaplane, but after a crash, he was told that replacement parts would take months to arrive. For a man accustomed to the efficiency of the logging industry, this delay was intolerable. He turned to Navy engineer Conrad Westervelt with a simple proposition. They could build a better plane themselves and do it faster. That broken supply chain shifted his focus from purchasing aircraft to manufacturing them. In 1916, Boeing and Westervelt partnered to build their own aircraft in a wooden boathouse on Seattle's Lake Union, incorporating as Pacific Aero Products Company. Boeing's need for control was immediate. When a hired test pilot arrived late for a taxi test, Boeing took the controls himself. He gunned the engine and unexpectedly lifted the craft off the water, performing the company's first flight by accident. This chart shows the company's early instability. The Navy initially rejected the design, and though World War I brought a brief surge in production, military orders vanished when the war ended. The workforce plummeted from over 300 employees to just 80. To prevent total collapse, Boeing paid his remaining staff out of his own pocket. He kept the factory running by having his aviation mechanics build wooden furniture and sea sleds while he waited for the aviation market to return. The post-war bust demonstrated that relying on the military was a strategic weakness. Boeing realized he had to establish a commercial use for flight to ensure long-term survival. That commercial focus began with logistics. In 1919, Boeing and pilot Eddie Hubbard delivered 60 letters from Vancouver to Seattle, marking the first international airmail delivery in the United States. He simultaneously built a pipeline for future talent. Boeing donated $6,000 to the University of Washington to construct a wind tunnel, provided the school established a formal aeronautical engineering program to feed his factory. A year after founding the company, he opened an office in Washington, D.C. He wanted a constant presence in the capital to monitor legislation and maintain direct access to the federal agencies that would eventually fund the industry. These efforts converged in 1927, when the Boeing Model 40 won a massive postal contract to carry mail across the treacherous Chicago to San Francisco route. The Model 40 design included a small cabin for 2 people, allowing Boeing to carry the first paying commercial passengers alongside the mailbags. Boeing's strategy reached beyond the hangar. He sought to control the training of engineers and the political machinery of the capital before a single passenger bought a ticket. With the mail routes secured, Boeing moved swiftly to consolidate the entire aviation market under one massive corporate structure. In 1929, he partnered with Frederick Rentschler of Pratt & Whitney to form a massive holding company, the United Aircraft and Transport Corporation. This chart shows the mechanics of his vertical monopoly. Boeing manufactured the airframes, Pratt & Whitney provided the engines, and their own airline, United Airlines, operated the flights. This structure cornered every stage of the industry. By owning the manufacturing and the operations, the corporation could dictate prices and exclude competitors from using its technology. Within 12 years, the company grew from a local workshop into a conglomerate with its own engine supply, manufacturing base, and transcontinental flight routes. This concentration of power triggered a swift federal response. In 1934, the U.S. government moved to dismantle the absolute control Boeing held over American aviation. This diagram illustrates the impact of the Airmail Act. The law targeted vertical monopolies, making it illegal for manufacturers to own the airlines operating them. The mandated breakup split the conglomerate into 3 entities: United Aircraft, Boeing Airplane Company, and United Airlines. Boeing viewed the antitrust investigation as an attack on his integrity. Refusing to operate within the new legal restrictions, he immediately resigned as chairman, sold his stock, and left the aviation industry forever. The same concentration of power that allowed Boeing to build a national aviation network was exactly what the Airmail Act was designed to prevent. Boeing spent his final decades in seclusion on his estates east of Seattle, breeding horses and developing residential real estate. In his land developments between 1935 and 1944, he applied the same rigid control he once brought to his factories. He placed restrictive covenants on his properties, legally forbidding them from being sold or leased to anyone not of the white or Caucasian race. These legal barriers enforced segregation on the ground, even as his former company developed technology to bridge vast distances in the air. Although Boeing was gone, his engineering standards survived him. They formed the basis for the B-17 Flying Fortress, the bomber that defined American air power during World War II. In 1954, as an elderly man, he returned to the company one last time to watch the rollout of the Dash 80, the prototype that would launch the age of commercial jet travel. William Boeing left behind a global network of aircraft and infrastructure, yet his final years were spent in a community of his own design, physically and legally separated from the world he helped connect.